And for project number 3, we did have a range of different modeling techniques demonstrated. So again, we've got some data dictionaries outlining the fields that this system is going to need to contain, and some understanding about why those fields are required. We've also got the basis here of a database structure, which looks like it's got multiple tables linked together, and is again a kind of an indicator of some complexity. And we also have a DFD diagram here comparing the old system, the old paper-based system, with the new computerized version, and showing understanding there the kinds of processing that's going to be involved, and also the actual people involved in interacting with the system as well, which could be useful later on in design. Okay, so the final bit then is we actually now arrive at the objectives. We've done the initial outline of the project, the dialogue and the research that was done, the modeling that was used, and the actual objectives now is kind of where we'll sort of draw some conclusions. Okay, and I think it's fairly clear, and I think most of you highlighted this in the feedback form, that the requirements for the project 1, the Endless Runner game, are very well defined. The majority of them are smart, they're very specific and clear. You know, if we just take this one for example about increasing in difficulty, we've actually then got a breakdown there about how difficulty is going to be measured and how difficulty can actually change. So in terms of the game speed increasing and the amount of law enforcement, and then a further breakdown. So everything is so clear and specific. It's very well written in terms of the majority of those requirements. Okay, they've also broken it down, haven't they, as well, these requirements. So this was just a subsection of the requirements focusing on the arcade mode within the game. Okay, the other key thing of course is that when you look at these requirements, so if we take this one or the law enforcement one for example, if you were to look back on the earlier research that was done, you can see where these requirements have come from. They've not just been plucked from thin air. You can actually see the story that led to those requirements being produced. Okay, so back in some of the research that was done, okay, which again indicates an excellent project. So the big reveal then, in terms of the actual score for this project, well, I think you were right to say that this was the best project there. I haven't actually managed to be able to track down a specific mark for just the analysis. However, this project by the centre itself was awarded 75 marks, so a full marks basically. The moderators of AQA moderated it to about 70 marks, but because that was still within tolerance, it actually kept the original 75 marks. So I think it's fair to say that this analysis is at least an 8 mark or a 9 mark example, and you can see what the actual chief moderator Martin thought of it. He thought it was an excellent, a very, very good project. Okay, is it an A-level project? Well, I think judging by these requirements and the increasing difficulty, the mention of object-oriented programming being the method by which this program is going to be delivered, it certainly suggests there's sufficient complexity for this to be considered an A-level project. Okay, so everyone, I think, by and large, was pretty much right with their verdict on project number 1. Project number 2, Snakes and Ladders. Okay, so we get to the requirements here, and they're certainly not as well written as project number 1. They're not particularly smart. In some cases they can be quite vague, so click something, cool something, I think you'll find in there. Here you go, yeah, so the wording in the requirements, and just clarity on that, if you were actually given this list of requirements and told to go and make this game, I think particularly if you didn't have any prior knowledge of Snakes and Ladders, you'd be kind of thinking, well, what on earth, make snakes, and then I've got description about actually moving the player's position backwards on the board. They're not very well written, they're not very clear, yeah, tricky one. Where have they come from as well? So again, some of these requirements we can see maybe some of the backstory from that research, but we haven't got that same level of connectivity. We can't really connect the research and the investigation so easily to these requirements. It's fairly standard that this is just a Snakes and Ladders game really. Okay, like, you know, for example, the ability and the need to be able to save and load games. Where, you know, where's that actually come from? Where was the suggestion in the earlier research that was a requirement for this game? Okay, so that's a bit of an issue here, and the other problem is maybe the evidence of complexity as well, and this is something that this project suffered from. The actual opportunity in the modelling section where they produced the flowchart, you know, they didn't really kind of demonstrate there that this game was particularly complex in any particular way, and none of the earlier research or the requirements kind of suggest that. And so the actual verdict from AQA, and you'll be maybe quite shocked to see this, is that although this was originally given a mark at 4 by the actual centre whose student this was, so this was initially given moderated at 4, and you can see some of the feedback on that. It was moderated down because it was not deemed A-level standard to just 1 single mark. Okay, so all of that work in this project was reduced to 1 single mark because it was not deemed an A-level project. Okay, and you can see the lack of dialogue. So there's hardly any dialogue in the investigation. Just really that questionnaire is the only evidence we've got, and that's been very poorly executed. And you can see here you know, they agree that the actual algorithms and the objectives are weak and not, you know, not very well specified. Okay, so yeah. It's quite shocking, that one. So originally was given a 4, and I think a lot of you I think the average for this was around 6 marks, wasn't it? But actually, because it wasn't A-level standard, moderated down to 1. So just highlighting that importance of conveying that complexity to the marker. Okay, and then project number 3, well, we end up with some requirements again at the end of project number 3. As has been the theme with number 3, they're not particularly great either, and that's probably due to the depth of research that's been done and the thoroughness of that research, and obviously they lack detail. The wording of them sometimes, you know, some of these are specific, but a lot of them you might find hard to actually measure and quantify whether or not they've been achieved. So that's still a problem. Whether or not, I mean, it's hard to judge this because, again, because of the initial research not being so great, whether these requirements fully describe the system that's going to be needed to kind of, you know, be a solution to the problems faced in the takeaway. So that's hard to deduce. However, we can see where these requirements have come from. They do make sense in terms of, you know, the features on here, things like being able to archive the order, the number of chefs working and sharing that information with the chefs, calculating the approximate food time. We can see that that has been born from that initial interview and some of the dialogue around that. So there is some backstory there. Okay, the question is it an A-level project? Well, let's have a look at what the AQA verdict was. And the actual verdict here was that this was awarded 4 marks again. So we've got the 4-mark award down here. But a lot of you, I think, would agree and also stated this. So that, you know, the background is brief. There's a lack of analysis on how the current system works in the takeaway. They've missed out a lot of things that could be included in that investigation. So, you know, maybe a menu. I suggested that they could have done an observation. The interview could have been far better, had a far better execution done. It's not gathering a huge amount of information for design purposes. And you can see some of those critical questions perhaps that were missing from that interview, which would be really important if you were to design a computer-based solution to it. The actual end objectives, I think, again, you'd probably agree, are poor. Some are measurable, but they're not detailed, and they're certainly not as clear as project number 1. Okay, but this one kept hold of its 4 marks. And I think probably the saving grace for this particular project was the modelling evidence. There was some limited evidence of dialogue, but there was some modelling evidence that suggested that this system was going to utilise a database, and that database was going to have multiple linked tables within it, and therefore it probably just scraped through on that for that particular reason, and avoided being slashed down to 1 mark. Okay, so there you go, that's the results, and hopefully that's been quite a useful activity for you guys to complete, and will give you some understanding about what those key characteristics are that have been looked for when you do your analysis, and maybe some ideas about how you can go about evidencing your work and analysis in a way that's going to really sort of enable you to access the higher marks on the mark scheme. Okay, so that's everything from me.